I'm gonna teach you how you can improve your cardiovascular endurance, and we're gonna start right now. I can hear all the meathead gurus out there going, no one wants to do cardio. It's gonna hinder our gains. It's gonna keep us small. And then they're gonna put up the meme, we don't wanna train like distance runners, we wanna train like the sprinters. And I think that's fair to a point, but we also have to understand endurance-based training can enhance overall strength gains. Endurance-based training can improve sports performance. It can improve recovery time for all athletes. And then if we start to look at field sports like football, lacrosse, soccer, field hockey, and then intense combat sports, MMA, BJJ, wrestling, we start to see that all of those sports have extreme strength components, they have extreme explosive components, and they also happen to have endurance in them. So we need to understand how we can enhance that explosive endurance so that someone can hit big movements or big positional domination if we're talking about wrestling later on in the match, or if we're talking about football, it's the fourth quarter. How can we dominate down in the trenches? We need to have some sense of endurance. So we're gonna go over what you can do to improve your endurance as an athlete and how that'll carry over to the sporting world. So thinking through endurance through the simplest terms, okay, through physiology and what is actually happening, there's something known as mitochondrial respiration, okay? So mitochondrial respiration is when the body's gonna use some form of energy, okay? We'll take something like glycogen and the body will use that energy source to create ATP. ATP is the body's currency. It's what determines how the body can actually move. So through using oxygen and then transferring energy into ATP, now the body can start to move. And this is all from mitochondrial respiration. If this doesn't happen, we can't move anymore. So now think about as well, we know that we have to improve mitochondrial respiration, and we also can increase the volume of mitochondria so that we can actually have more mitochondria respirating. So this is a key concept to understand as we move forward through the physiology. Now we can get into how can this impact our performance with endurance. And most research around endurance-based training is going to be under sprint interval training, high intensity interval training, and then LSD, long, slow distance training. So in essence, from all three of those categories, we want substrate metabolism to trigger and enhance our overall endurance, and we want mitochondrial mass to improve our overall endurance. So by understanding the respiratory aspect, understanding the mitochondrial mass aspect, that's gonna help us. And then also understanding things like citrate synthase activation and regulatory proteins from something known as P53. Now we can start to see those mechanisms, but in all reality, most of this stuff is still gonna go back to which type of training can increase our mitochondrial mass or volume, and which type of training can improve our mitochondrial respiration. So if we just look at it as simply as possible, that's going to help us make some headway into what's going to improve the type of endurance that you might need for your specific sport.
If you want to improve your cardio and you're a bigger guy like me, doing cardio and going out for runs can really beat up your joints. And that can prevent me from reaping the benefits of doing endurance-based training. That's why I love using low-impact methods for endurance-based training. That's why I recommend using the Turbo Exercise Bike from today's video sponsor, Moby Fitness. The Turbo Exercise Bike has a sleek, elegant, and aesthetic exterior that looks great in any home gym or commercial. It has a digital control dial that allows you to ramp up and down the resistance so you can decide how hard you want to push yourself. And unlike other bikes that I've often used, this bike is silent, so you can work out without feeling like you're disturbing others. It also comes with an app that you can pair with your phone or tablet. There's no subscription needed and has customizable metrics and professional classes for you to follow along with. Pick up the Turbo Exercise Bike and free access to the app by using our link in the description. Not only that, it's extremely easy to set up. It legit took us 15 minutes to put everything together. Now that you have the right tool, let's get back to improving your cardiovascular endurance.
So if we know that basically it comes down to mitochondrial mass and respiration, and then it comes down to these three types of training: sprint interval training, high intensity interval training, and long slow distance,
what improves what. And initially, we know that high intensity interval training and long slow distance can contribute to increasing that mitochondrial mass, the volume of mitochondria, right? So that's a pretty clear understanding that we have. And we know that if we are trying to build a big base, if we're a CrossFitter and we're trying to enhance our base and create this bigger engine, typically we should be starting with that long, slow distance. Think about someone like Matt Frazier, who was on the rower every single day for a year plus. He was improving the mitochondrial volume in his body. And then on the other side, sprint interval training, along with a little bit of high intensity interval training, has been shown to improve the respiration rate of our mitochondria. So if mitochondria is respirating a little bit more effectively, they can turn over ATP at a higher pace, and then the mitochondria is respirating at a more efficient rate. Now we have more energy and we can sustain our movement pattern at a higher intensity for a longer period of time. So this takes us into our application. Okay, we understand now that there's sprint interval training, there's high intensity interval training, which will be over a longer period of time, typically with a little bit shorter rest periods, and then there's long, slow distance. Long, slow distance could be 30 to 60 minutes on a rower, on a bike, doing a jog, whatever. What we can do first is test our athletes. So test yourself. Can you sustain 5 to 10 minutes of a steady state? Are you able to do that, or do you die off really quickly? And vice versa too. If we get into this and we go out and let's say we run hills, and we can run 2 or 3 hills at 90% intensity, and then by the 4th hill, we're running at 50% intensity, well, clearly we're not able to have positive respiration at a higher intensity over a longer period of time. So now we can take that and say, all right, if this person in our hill scenario is a wrestler or a football player, they're probably gonna die off in the 3rd period. If they're a football player, they're probably gonna die off in the 2nd quarter or the 3rd quarter, not even make it to the 4th quarter. So now we can start to see where that application is gonna come into play. And this is also where we can start to bring in, 2 to 3 days a week. Let's just do long, slow distance work. We've got a whole bunch of football players, a whole bunch of field hockey players. Let's spend, 12 to 15 weeks out from training camp. Let's spend that time 2 times a week, 30 to 60 minutes, just on the bike, just on the rower, maybe doing something cyclical, even getting into the swimming pool. Let's just build that mass, build that volume, and it's gonna improve their overall recovery from their strength training work as well. And while we're doing that, we can start to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We can start to talk about strategy while they're doing long, slow distance training. And then over time, we can start to bring in high intensity interval training. And then slowly, as the athlete develops and as their work capacity increases, we can start to play around with doing sprint-based interval training at certain times of the week, and also doing long, slow distance training at certain times of the week, and start to figure out how does that impact the specific sport, how does it improve their overall respiratory capacity, and how does that impact the performance that we're trying to see from the individual athlete. So 1 to 2 times a week throughout the summer, we can get on the assault bike, we can get on a rower. Hey, 30 to 60 minutes, we're gonna test you on our plays, we're gonna test you on strategy. You have to do this while we're doing that long, slow distance. And then one day we might do 5-minute repeats. So it's a little bit more of a high intensity interval training. Or we're gonna do 10 to 15 second bursts followed by 60 to 90 second rest periods. So that's gonna be more sprint interval training. And that's where we're gonna see their overall respiratory capacity increase. So now they can start to sustain that work over a longer period of time. Ideally, we would get to the point where these athletes, these football players, would get to the season and they could do 5 to 10 sprint interval based training bouts with minimal diminishment in their overall quality of work. So that's when we're timing what they're doing. We're timing how long they have to cover a distance. And then we can take that and try and impact the play of the game. Maybe we're running a spread offense that's a no huddle offense, because we know that conditioning is king and we can wear down the opposing team's defense. This is where all this stuff can come into play, especially if we're focusing on how the endurance aspect is going to transfer over to the sport. So we know how this can transfer over to the sport. We know that endurance can improve recovery. We know that endurance-based training can actually enhance sprint interval training, so that can actually improve our explosive endurance later on in different types of bouts. If we're wrestling, if we're swimming, if we're playing football, whatever it is that we might be doing where we need explosive-based endurance. We also understand now the difference between mitochondrial mass and mitochondrial respiration, and what type of training impacts what aspect of that mitochondrial function and how it can create ATP. And then we started to break down, all right, how does this transfer over to the sport? When do we use long, slow distance? When do we use sprint interval-based training? When do we bridge the two with some high intensity interval training? And then that's gonna lead to better performance on the field and a positive impact on our overall strategy as coaches. Remember, freaks, if you wanna become a champion, you always have to cultivate your power. Peace. What's up, guys? Our podcast and our channel are sponsored by our own strength training app, Peak Strength. The entire focus of Peak Strength is to provide you guys with the absolute best sports performance app that you could ever imagine. We build out the programs on the back end. We take in all of these different decisions that we learned here on site at Garage Strength so that we can then apply it to you so you can improve your training. So if you guys want to improve your overall sports performance, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength. You'll get a free week of training, and then you can start getting on those gains, get those reps done so that you can become a champion. Now, let's get back to the video. Peace. We're gonna go into training for strength endurance and what you can do to improve your own strength endurance. And we're gonna start right now. What the heck is strength endurance? So we're doing a prolonged activity that requires a large amount of muscular tension, okay? But we wanna see a minimal decrease in efficiency for that muscular tension. So the efficiency has to maintain at a high rate. And good examples for means of strength endurance would be, let's say specifically for a rower or a boxer or that strength endurance. If you have a fighter, someone who's fighting in the UFC or in MMA, by the end of that first round, they're already tapping into their training that's going to increase their strength endurance. And if we think about even a wrestler, okay, so if we're talking about the international style, we're wrestling freestyle, we're gonna have that first period where they're gonna start to tap into strength endurance, and then most of that second period is gonna be really hammering the attributes that that athlete has trained around strength endurance. And a lot of this goes back to how does your body handle CO2? How does your body handle lactic acid? How does your body handle it globally? And then how does your body handle it locally in specific muscular groups? And then even thinking about CrossFitters, strongmen, all of these types of athletes need some sense of strength endurance, and even weightlifters, shot putters, typically athletes that are gonna be power-based sports, they need a little bit of strength endurance to a point within their own personal training, within their own training sessions, okay? Because they might have a training session that lasts, over an hour and a half to 2 hours. So there's a bunch of different factors that go into strength endurance, but it's key to understand the main focus here is that if we have muscular tension in a movement, again, think about wrestlers, they're in a collar tie, they're always grappling. They need to have a minimal decrease in the muscular efficiency and the muscular coordination throughout that prolonged activity. Okay, so now we're specifically gonna go into some more of the theory behind it. And then after we cover the theory on how we can analyze strength endurance, then we're gonna go deeper into the actual examples and actual situations that you can utilize inside your own training. So we've gotta understand right away fast twitch muscle fibers. Fast twitch muscle fibers is gonna be most related to maximal power output. And then if we have, let's say, slower twitch muscle fibers. So slower twitch muscle fibers are going to be more related to longer endurance. If we're going for a mile run, that's going to be much more slower twitch. Okay, so going back to that fast twitch, we can think about executing a vertical jump. Now, and then finally, if we go into understanding, there might be some instances where we have to have fast twitch muscle fibers and we have to have slow twitch muscle fibers working together. So that might be a sport like wrestling where you actually have to have a large amount of power output, but we also have to have a large amount of aerobic capacity. Same thing with a sport like CrossFit. Okay, and now if we go into, in 1990, Brunner and Tabachnik came up with and started to understand and recognize that there's really this hybrid style of muscle fiber. That was essentially like the first time in science where we're like, there actually might be another fiber here that's a little bit of a combination between a fast twitch and a slower twitch fiber. And that's typically where we're gonna wanna work most of our efforts if we're in a sport that requires a large amount of strength endurance. Remember, rowing, boxing, fighting, swimming, and then CrossFit, strongman, even all of this stuff. Now we have to have really, really potent fast twitch muscle fibers, but we also have to find the easiest means and the easiest ways to train those aerobic slower twitch muscle fibers. And then that's gonna take us into that next step before we get into that direct application is I like to look at it from a large magnitude, and that might be from an actual global perspective and a little bit more time involved, and then from that smaller magnitude. So that might be actually digging down into a localized specific area. Okay, so the first thing that we've got to do is that large magnitude. This could be an example in training where we actually would use, you know, on the minute cleans. And this is something that we do with our football players. Okay, so football does need to have strength endurance. Football players, before we're going into the season, we might do 15 to 16 sets of singles or even doubles sometimes at a certain percentage with 45 to 60 seconds rest. Okay, so what this mimics, it mimics what you're gonna be doing on the field. It's a shorter rest period and it's happening cyclically, okay, over and over and over again. So you might have to do a power clean or a 2-box clean, anything like that. And then we can get into another aspect if we have this large magnitude. Okay, so going back to the on the minutes, that might be a 15 to 16 minute round, right? And then we can get into actual sport play. So using swimmers, using wrestlers as an example, is if you develop the motor and you identify as a strength coach that this individual has great aerobic capacity, but they can really increase their dynamic power output. Well, we need to train that dynamic power output while also recognizing and understanding that they still have to maintain that aerobic capacity that they already have. That's an example with Nick Wazowski, our 2-time world bronze medalist. He has phenomenal aerobic capacity, but one of those things is he's got to get stronger. He has to get a little bit more explosive. He's got to hold positions a little bit better. When we first started working together, now, you know, 4 or 5 years later, he's great in all areas. That comes back to actually training sport play. So if we're in the weight room, we're trying to focus on that dynamic capacity or the aerobic capacity, and we're building that up in the weight room. But then there's also that specific transfer from just getting minutes on the mat, or if you're a swimmer, getting more meters in, getting more volume in the pool. If you're a distance runner, getting more volume in out, you know, running 100 miles a week. That's what these top-notch guys are doing. And so that goes back to that sport play. And other examples of means to increase that large magnitude. So this might be an interval-based training on an assault bike, on a rower, but you're doing something cyclical over and over again. Then we're going to get into jumps or throws over a longer period of time. So some people will shy away from this because they don't want it to diminish power output potentially. But if you train athletes properly with jumps, with throws, you can actually increase their strength endurance. But you have to actually focus and really understand how to do that properly, because it can get very challenging. And then finally, you know, just doing specific rounds of something. Again, this is similar to that sport play, but let's use the example of a wrestler or of an MMA fighter, is that we might go 30 seconds of an all-out scramble for wrestling, or we might go 30 seconds or even 10 seconds of an all-out push on an assault bike, and then back off into that rest period. So you're using that rounds theory. Okay, so then the next 2 things that we need to do is we need to understand there is a point where we have to do technical work under fatigue, because if we're training strength endurance, we want it to transfer really well to whatever that technical sport is that we're doing. So there's points where in the weight room, you want to get somebody into a high level of fatigue and then do a little bit of technical work in the weight room. That's okay. But now we can get into that small magnitude, okay? So this would be localized to specific muscle groups, okay? So most of the time, if we're talking about strength endurance specifically, it's typically going to be your quads, your calves, your biceps, your triceps, your deltoids, your lats, you know, a lot of your shoulders. So if you talk to a wrestler, you talk to, I mean, even a swimmer, when they get out of the pool and you see how they're feeling, they're going to be gassed and their arms are just going to be completely dead. Their lats are going to be smoked, okay? So now if we have a specific wrestler or a fighter or a swimmer or a rower, we can start to localize and say, all right, this rower, their lower back has tremendous strength endurance, but their lats and deltoids are pathetic. So now we can see that from a localized perspective and then train that locally through specific means of strength endurance. And that's where we can get into isolating those specific muscles, using drop sets, using contrast methods. And then ultimately, one of the best ways, and this is what we're going to get into in the applied section here, is one of the best ways of training both dynamically from a large magnitude and from a small magnitude is incorporating isometric actions, okay? So if we have isometric actions where we have to hold positions against an immovable object, or even just holding a position like a split lunge over a long period of time, that can help us increase our overall strength endurance, and it's not gonna totally beat us up. It's gonna be mentally challenging and it's gonna be physically challenging, but it's a unique way to train strength endurance and have it really transfer well over to your specific sport. And so now we're gonna get into exact examples and tools that we use to increase strength endurance for various athletes. One of my favorite methods to increase that large magnitude and to have a great carryover to specific sport play is going to be on the minute drills. And this could be power snatch, a power clean, any snatch or clean variation. I would even argue a trap bar jump or trap bar deadlift or a back squat or a front squat. And you might do 10 doubles with 45 seconds rest. So you want to go at like 65 to 70% of your best power clean, of your best clean, and do a single or a double over 10 to 15 minutes, okay? Every single 45 seconds, you hit that rep, okay? So that's a way that you can drastically increase your overall strength endurance and power endurance. And that's one of the big factors here, is that we have to, and this is where a lot of strength coaches will say, well, you don't want to focus on doing an extremely explosive movement with minimal rest periods, because it could, in theory, have a negative impact on your power output. But if your sport is long duration periods of contact and muscular tension, you have to learn, if you're in a 20-minute scrap in wrestling or a 20-minute period of fighting, or you're a CrossFitter and you have a session that might be an hour long, you have to have high power endurance, okay? And that's where this strength endurance stuff does come into play. So another method that we can use similar to the on the minute would be a rest pause method. And this could be a method that you're using to increase your overall power output and your overall maximal strength. And then later on, you might use that rest pause locally with some bicep work. But I would even recommend here, let's say you do a back squat. You do a back squat for 4, you rest 30 seconds, you do another back squat for 4, you rest 30 seconds, you do another back squat for 4, and this might be at 80 to 85% of your max. Basically, you go until you feel like total death. And this is gonna help increase your strength, but it's also gonna help drastically improve your strength endurance and your mental acuity, because it is extremely challenging. Now, mechanical drop sets. This is a really, really good way to train both the large magnitude and the small magnitude. A mechanical drop set example would be that we wanna do some type of big movement first. So let's say a back squat or a front squat, right? And then that next movement that we wanna do after that back squat might be a goblet squat, so it's a little bit easier. And then that final movement might be more isolation focused, so then it's gonna be, back squat, goblet squat, into even, and this would be unique, where you might get into sled work, pulling a sled backwards, and you're just basically isolating your quads, doing a leg extension if you have issues with quad fatigue late in a period or whatever sport that you're doing. Maybe you go back squat to stimulate your quads, then you go a Spanish squat, so it's a goblet squat with a band around your knees, and then you go into a large amount of leg extensions where you can go 25 to 30 reps. So the mechanical aspect, it gets easier each exercise. This could be similar to pre-fatigue or post-fatigue even, but mechanical drop sets can be used to really train globally. And then if you have that specific area, let's say a good example would be your lats. Okay, so now we go a rope climb. So it's a very challenging coordinative movement. So you're doing a rope climb, okay? And then the next exercise that you're gonna do is going to be, a weighted reclining row or a neutral grip pull-up. That might be that second mechanical point after the rope climb. The rope climb is very challenging, and then a simple pull-up here, and you might do 5 to 7 reps. And then you have to go do a sled pull with a rope, where that's easy from a coordination point, but it's challenging because it might take you 30 to 50 seconds to get that done. And it's really gonna focus on your lats, your biceps, and your grip. So that's a way to use that mechanical drop set if you're a swimmer, if you're, if you are a rower, even if you are a wrestler. And now power work with intervals. This is another really good example. So this could be a little bit more of an undulation in an entire session, but now we spend, let's say, the first 35 minutes of a training session where we are just focusing directly on max power output and then maximal strength. And so this is what I stole directly from Phil Daru, one of the best strength coaches in the entire world, who trains some of the best MMA fighters in the world. Okay, and so what we did is he put me through an entire workout where we really focused on maximal strength and maximal power output. And then we sort of took a 5 to 10 minute break just to try and regroup. And then we hit that interval based training. So you can get on the assault bike, you can go, 10 to 15 seconds at max wattage, and then back off for 45 to 50 seconds, and then do that 5, 6, 7 times. And that's gonna really train your power output, and it's gonna train your overall strength endurance. And you're gonna get stronger and increase your strength endurance. So you're gonna have better efficiency later on in a fight or later on in a match. Now, long duration steady state. I think this is one of the easiest ways to increase your gas tank. Okay, so if we're thinking about strength endurance, I think it is extremely easy to focus on specifics on the minutes, to focus on mechanical drop sets. Those are easy things to train, but the best means that I've found is training long duration steady state. Okay, so that might mean you get on the assault bike and you hold a specific RPMs. Let's say you hold 60 RPMs for 35 to 40 minutes. Okay, so it's like one of those areas where it's hard, but it's not gonna ruin your training, okay? It's just, you've just gotta be into it a little bit. It's not overly challenging. You can still have conversations while you're training. You can actually still, listen to an audiobook or whatever you want, but it will challenge you enough to get your wind going so that you have to process CO2 a little bit more effectively. And that's the whole goal here. So long duration steady state, and I like to do this on a rower, a ski erg, on an assault bike, because it's not gonna beat you up. It's gonna be cyclical based, and it can really help you focus on your quads or on your lats, because that's where you're gonna feel it later on. And then finally, when we get into it, there's a lot of science, the efficacy of stimulating heat shock proteins, okay? So if you get in the sauna 4 to 5 days a week for 30 minutes at a time, 20 to 30 minutes at a time at 170 degrees Fahrenheit, it's gonna help your strength endurance. Now, you still have to train, you still have to do all this other stuff. It's not the magic bullet, but it will help with recovery and it will help with strength endurance. And then finally, the absolute best means here would be, let's take an isometric example, okay? So let's say you have a wrestler who struggles with strength endurance in their bicep or in their grip. You can do specifically focused work where you do a sled pull, or you do a rope climb, and in the period in between where you're resting, you could hold isometrically a barbell at 90 degrees, okay? And you could do something similar to that where, let's say you do a sled pull forward, a sled push back to the other side of the gym, and then a sled pull backwards, okay? So you're doing 3 types of movements on a sled. And then you isometrically hold a split squat or a lunge for 90 seconds on each side, okay? At 90 degrees. So that's a way to drastically increase your strength endurance, because you're going to be able to put out a large amount of power and a large amount of strength into the sled, and then you're using that recovery time with that isometric action. And so the main goal here then is that you have to have some ability after you would execute this, and maybe this would be done, you have an on the minute or a rest pause setup, and at the end of the training session, you do 20 minutes of steady state cardio. After that, I always recommend doing some type of technical work while you're fatigued. That might mean visualization. That might mean sort of like shadow boxing if you're a fighter or you're a wrestler, shadow drilling. If you're a thrower, doing some type of mimicking something with a band. Anything that has a lower level of intensity, but you're still stimulating your mind to execute technically while you're under fatigue, because that's the main goal. If we're going to increase our strength endurance, we need it to transfer over to our specific sport. So you can use all of these different concepts directly in your training, but you have to break down, where are you struggling the most? Are you struggling from that large global magnitude, or are you struggling in a localized specific muscle? And if you are, you can use isolation movements. You could even do something as simple as a pull-up with a 50 straight curls, because your biceps just die when you're wrestling. Well, that's a drop set using contrast training, using isolation methods to increase the strength endurance in a localized specific muscle group. So don't shy away from bodybuilding movements. Don't shy away from using all of these different examples to improve your overall strength endurance. So this concept is extremely challenging. It's difficult to understand, but there's a lot of different moving pieces at play. And we use information like this inside of our Sports Performance Bible to help you guys understand these concepts and apply it directly into your training. You can click on the link down below, head over to garagestrength.com, and you can pick up our Sports Performance Bible book and video course to help you understand sports performance training. Remember, cultivate your power. Peace. Strength endurance, cardio, conditioning is king. We're gonna give you those key aspects to make you an endurance freak, and we're gonna start right now. So we're here with Ian Ross, who's been on the national team for sprint canoeing every year since 2009. And Ian's about to start his high intensity interval training portion of this workout. Okay, so this is a workout that you guys can take and do today. So what we're gonna start with is Ian's gonna hit 20 straight seconds as hard as possible. We wanna get those RPMs as high as possible. Then he's gonna have an active recovery for 40 straight seconds, and we're gonna do that for 12 to 15 minutes, depending upon when he feels like he's gonna die. Go. Okay, good. That was all up at like 105 to 110. Did you have any caffeine this morning? No caffeine?
Just water.
Did you sleep in your van?
I got like 8 hours, I think.
You got 5 seconds. Go. Come on. Come on. Come on. Keep moving. Keep moving. Come on. Good. Go. So Ian is in the process of hitting those high intensity interval trainings. So one of the big aspects is that if you're trying to improve your cardio, you should be doing this like 20 to 30 minutes a week minimum. Ideally, at a world-class level, you're gonna be doing that 40 minutes a week every single week. Good. And that's gonna help drastically improve your body's ability to respirate. The mitochondrial respiration rate will increase, and over a long period of time, you're gonna see your VO2 max start to improve, and in turn, you're gonna see your red blood cell mass, your hemoglobin mass increase, and that's gonna help that delivery of oxygen. So if you can do this on an assault bike, you can do this on a rower, you can even do this on hill sprints. Go! And that's going to improve that ability specific to your sport. So if you're a wrestler, even if you're an 800-meter runner, even if you're a canoeer, 20 to 40 minutes a week, figure out what those exercises are gonna be that are gonna help you with your overall endurance. That's good. That's gonna drastically improve that mitochondrial respiration and help you with that oxygen transport. 30 seconds. So when I look at endurance, I like to pitch it very simply. Oh, you gotta increase your mitochondrial volume. Oh, you gotta increase your mitochondrial respiration. All those things are important. We gotta improve our VO2 max. We gotta improve that red blood cell mass. All those things are great. But what does that mean for athletes, right? So if we can look at it as we need to improve global endurance, go! We need to improve localized endurance, and then we need to improve that specific endurance. So global endurance would be, we need to just be in shape. So we've got to do things like LSD work. We've got to do things like high intensity interval training so that we can be in that fourth quarter, or we can be in overtime and still be able to accomplish what we need to accomplish. Go! Now, if we're looking at specific local problems, okay, think about a wrestler and they might say, man, in overtime or in that third period, my legs feel dead. So locally, in that situation, we need to work on their endurance in their legs, or we need to work on that endurance in their arms. Same if we're thinking about an offensive lineman, right? They're holding bad position, they're getting into a bad position because their lower back's really fatigued late in that fourth quarter. When we think through that lens, that localized area is gonna be their lower back or potentially their glutes. When we're thinking about somebody like Ian, that might be localized to his lats or his biceps because he's a canoeer. Now we get into that specific aspect, and that specific aspect for him would be, how is his endurance on the boat? For the wrestler, go! That would be actually wrestling consistently, and then we could potentially in the weight room do things like stance and motion. For a basketball player, that might be doing higher speed drills when they're under fatigue. For a football player, that might be doing some type of high intensity interval training on the gridiron and then having them hold positions when they're coming off the line. So we want to look at it as global, and typically global can be trained through LSD. That localized aspect is going to be specific to those muscles that each sport is going to use, and then specificity is going to be directly related to the sport. So it's sort of a triangle that feeds one another, and we've got to figure out what each athlete needs to improve their overall endurance. Hey, we still got some lifts that we gotta do.
That's all good. I'll be there.
That was a nice one.
Yeah.
That looks like oatmeal.
Oatmeal and peanut butter.
Peanut butter still tastes good on the second time. Okay, so we just got done that high intensity interval portion of the workout. Now, a lot of people are gonna say, well, when should we do LSD work? So if you can do LSD work 120 to 180 minutes a week, spread out over the week, that could be as simple as walking, going on a treadmill, something along those lines. We're not gonna do that in this specific workout. The next thing that we're gonna be doing is we're gonna do some form of potentiation specific to Ian's sport. So think about that. You can take whatever sport you're doing and say, I wanna work on a specific aspect getting stronger. That's gonna be the potentiation point. Then we're gonna backdoor that with specific localized endurance. So we're gonna work on the seal row here, trying to be as explosive as possible, accelerating as well as possible. That's something that transfers really well to the canoe over to Ian in the boat. That's gonna end up leading to us focusing on the localized problems that he might have when he's on the boat through his biceps, through his lats. So we're gonna get into this next portion, and this is gonna be about potentiation. All right, so I'm gonna do a set of 4 as explosive as possible. I'm trying to get a little bit of a pump here. The only rowing I've ever done is in a canoe.
Yeah, it's a little different.
Good. So ideally what's gonna happen is that's gonna light him up, get 4 or 5 more sets. His nervous system's starting to fire really well. Through those 4 to 5 sets, he's recovered about 15 minutes since bike work. And then you're gonna see what we're gonna finish off with. And again, this is something cool that you guys could do where you start off with that high intensity interval training, okay? And then you can still hit some good strength training that's going to help that strength endurance. Good. With wrestling too, it's like, and with you guys, you have to be really explosive,
Yeah.
but also have the engine to handle it.
Yeah, and then like you just make that engine a little longer through your technique by being efficient.
Okay, so we're gonna get into the strength endurance part. So we hit that potentiation after the high intensity work. So now we're gonna get into strength endurance. This is gonna be more local based. So we're gonna go pull-ups that we're gonna battle back and forth. I'm gonna go basically till I'm about 1 to 2 reps out from dying. Ian's gonna go, we're gonna go back and forth, and we're gonna do 2 more exercises to really target that strength endurance of our lats and of our biceps. I gotta beat Ian's ass in pull-ups. That's good. Oh.
I don't need a box because I'm not a Oompa Loompa.
Yeah. This is gonna be hard. I can feel it right now. Good. So remember, strength endurance, minimal rest. Get right back into it. Oh, shit. Me, goddamn. Okay. So I'm gonna do one more after Ian goes here. And then we're gonna start doing a little bit easier work, but still gonna go right away. Focusing on the strength endurance that we're looking to improve. I'm not doing 40. I don't have strength endurance.
Come on, 5. There you go.
That's good. Ian can go. He's the important one. Come on. Need another one. Up. 1 or 2 more, let's go. Up. Come on, another one, let's go. Squeeze at the top, squeeze it. Good, okay, so we'll rest a minute and then we'll go right into the next exercise. I don't have strength endurance. All right, so now we're going more strength endurance. I was thinking 2 sets here, basically to failure. Try to get 30. Bitch. I'm still offended by that Oompa Loompa comment.
Just because it was accurate? I got the advantage, I got him laughing.
Let's go 1 set with the garage grips, 1 set without them.
Okay.
So the other thing is too, is like this is gonna be it's so much less taxing than doing, the high intensity work on the bike or even the work with the seal row. This is a lot easier to recover from because it's mainly just bis and lats. Now Ian's got that middle schooler grip. Come on. Come on. Good. 2 more, 2 more, 2 more. Squeeze those shoulder blades. Let's go. Good. Come on. Ball go right away. That's good. Usually I will say 3 finishers for strength endurance for problem areas. You're looking at problem areas or performance areas. And this for Ian, it's much more of a performance area as a canoeer. Come on. Come on, 2 more, 2 more. Give another one. Come on, squeeze it. Good. So we'll rest a minute and we'll go last exercise. Okay, so the next exercise, I'm gonna do it a way sort of like bodybuilding wise, and then Ian's gonna do it a way that's very specific to his sport. And when we were designing Peak Strength, some of the big factors around training was if we were gonna have rowing inside of the app, we had to figure out that strength endurance component. And so even inside of our different programs, we've got rowing, we've got 35 other sports, we've got athletic fitness and weightlifting. All of those different sports to a point need some sense of strength endurance. And that's one of those key parts around training that we want you guys to try. You guys can head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store, or the Apple iOS Store, download that today and get those 5 free workouts to improve that strength endurance. Boom. All right. So mine's a little more bicep, because my biceps are as strong as Ian's quads. And then when Ian goes, he's gonna show you the super specific strength endurance work that he's gonna do. Oh, that's good. I don't even know how many that was.
8.
Shut up, it was not 8. Maybe it was though. So Ian's going to demonstrate a little more specific. Good lengthening there, long lat. And one other aspect I wanted to bring up while Ian's doing this is the research around VO2 max and the red blood cell mass. The red blood cell mass is what some distance runners reap when they're taking nandrolone. Nandrolone will increase red blood cell mass, which means hemoglobin will transport oxygen to your muscles more effectively. So that's one of the benefits around a PED like that. Now, one way to increase that, if we can increase that red blood cell mass, the hemoglobin transport, that protein that's taking oxygen, can actually get improved and then lead to a greater VO2 max. If we're taking something like iron, if you're a little bit iron deficient, iron can help. Altitude training can help if you do it the right way, okay? If you go about it properly And then finally, heat stress or heat shock proteins, okay? Getting in the sauna, spending that time in the sauna will also lead to a positive impact on that red blood cell mass, ideally then leading to the increase in your VO2 max. I feel like you did like 30 and I did a total of 30. Yo, we just broke the cable.
Let's go.
That's the first.
Is that a weed thing though?
I just broke the cable.
Everyone who's a part of this gym just broke the cable.
The last time I did this, I broke a lat pull machine in high school around on it. Yeah, you can put your foot like that. Ooh, this is good. Ooh, oh, you get a nice stretch in that lower lat too, right here. All right, so we're rigging that up. We came over here from the tricep. Ian's gonna finish with this eccentric. Ian's gonna finish with the wheel, which is going to slaughter him. Then really squeeze that hard at the bottom. Yeah, yeah. Good. Bigger pop of that top too if you can, right there, come on. Good. Dude, the interesting part watching you do this too is we could change the height of that like 3 different ways.
Yeah.
Come on. Big squeeze. So this is like the exact position you get in the boat.
Yep. It's just I would be pulling from here.
Dude, I feel like you're gonna feel it in your abs too.
Yep. That thing's good.
Yeah, that.
Like for us, like you're here, right? And you're like there, and then you pull. So like if you could rig it to just come straight out from here.
I was just thinking if we lowered that, that would be really good.
I could just like sit there and like go for 4 minutes. I'd be
Yeah, yeah. That would be strength endurance. So focus on that global work. Get that LSD work on your own time in most cases. Then you can focus on that localized strength endurance. And then obviously you have to have that endurance that's very specific to your sport. Do all these things if you want to improve your overall endurance. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion,
You've always got to cultivate your power.
peace. Should a football player train like a swimmer? Should a basketball player train like a fighter? Every sport is different, meaning every single sport needs the right form of endurance and cardio for them to become elite. We're gonna cover all the endurance that every single athlete needs, and we're gonna start right now. What would endurance work be like without discussing running? What we identify as classical endurance inside of garage strength program design is typically where long, slow distance is gonna fall. Long, slow distance will be running a 5K, running a 10K, running even a half marathon, maybe even up to a marathon if you're training for a marathon. But this often is gonna be dependent upon the individual's ability. Now, when we're talking about sports performance and durational strength characteristics, that's where the endurance training becomes much more nuanced. It's not as simple as just doing that long, slow distance. So in garage strength program design, we break down traditional resistance-based training into 5 key components for durational strength characteristics. And that's gonna start with blast impulse. So that's being really, really explosive very, very quickly. That's gonna be sustained impulse, which might be about 10 to 15 seconds. Then we're gonna get into sustained power. Think about if we have an athlete like a wrestler who's going through some type of scramble. That's gonna be potentially 20 to 30 seconds. And then finally, we're gonna get into power endurance and classical endurance. So each sport uses at least 1 to 2 forms of endurance-based work. So strength training to improve your specific endurance type is absolutely vital. And that's exactly why inside of our strength training app, Peak Strength, we've created programming to target the specific problem areas for your specific sport. You're gonna be given a planned out program with specific exercises, rep ranges, and weights. And that's gonna be all dependent upon whether or not you're in or out of season. Peak Strength is out right now, so head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store to download Peak Strength and get those 5 free workouts that we're gonna give you so you can start that journey. But for this video, let's start with honing in on that sustained power output. And again, that's gonna be about 10 to 30 seconds of interval style endurance-based focus. Then if we look at power endurance, that's gonna be 30 seconds all the way up to potentially 2 minutes of actual work. Think about David Rudisha breaking the world record in the 800 meters in 1 minute and 41 seconds. He needs to have a lot of sustained power output. And then we bring in classical endurance. Classical endurance is gonna be anything over that 2-minute timeline. Think about running, again, that 5K, running a 10K, maybe running a marathon. And so if we're gonna talk about durational strength and endurance, we have to talk about the energy systems involved. And I want to dispel a small myth here. Coaches love to say that anything under 15 seconds, that's gonna be the alactic energy system. And anything over that 15 seconds, all the way up to say a minute or 1.5 minutes, that's gonna be the glycolytic energy system. And then anything over top of that 1.5 minutes, that's gonna be our aerobic capacity. That's gonna be our aerobic system. But there's something that we have to bring up. I'm standing here right now using my aerobic system. We are always using oxygen. The body is not only breathing in oxygen, we also need to be effectively transporting that oxygen to then be used as well as possible. This is why when shot putters just spend a little bit extra time doing endurance-based work, very low endurance-based work, they're able to recover faster and actually get stronger. So that first key, endurance-based training increases cardiac output. Your heart gets stronger. And this is where we're gonna see a direct correlation with sprint work, with interval work. There's an immediate impact on that cardiac output. There's an immediate impact on your mitochondrial respiration. So that second key, endurance-based training, is gonna increase that blood plasma volume. And we can even see blood plasma volume increase from heat exposure. So these two aspects will play a major role in overall endurance-based training. And then that third key factor is that endurance training will increase hemoglobin levels. There's a direct correlation with increasing hemoglobin levels and improving your VO2 max. Long, slow distance and interval work will be a major factor at play, which will lead to that improvement in your VO2 max. Now let's look at some key factors that fall under different sporting umbrellas, and we're gonna even dial in on specific sports and their sports specificity work and the interplay that that has on durational strength characteristics. Certain sports will have an aspect of intervals, so we have to find a ratio of how long someone's doing an action, how long their rest period is gonna be, and then how long until that action occurs again. And then finally, there also has to be an aspect around body weight. Is there a load that the individual is working against? Think about football, think about wrestling. These are gonna have those body weight aspects. If the athletic action inside of the sport takes less than 20 seconds, there's gonna be a much higher degree of interval work. And if we're talking about a sport like CrossFit or football, and the load that you're opposing is gonna be greater than your body weight, then there needs to be a decent amount of traditional resistance-based training as well. In other sports, such as wrestling, there's a lot of endurance work being done on the mat or inside of that competitive practice area. A lot of endurance might be triggered just by doing their sports skill. So we can train endurance to a point, but we have to be aware of what they're doing with their specific practice. And this is where we're gonna go a little bit deeper into that interval ratio. So interval ratio sports like CrossFit, football, wrestling, these are all gonna be based around doing endurance work at least twice a week. That's gonna provide us that golden ticket to endurance work. So in programming frequency, we also have to factor in there might be interval work done within that sport specificity. So take something like football. If they're doing 7-on-7 scrimmages at a faster pace, that can take care of that interval frequency. If you have a wrestler and they're doing a live drilling session or they're doing flow wrestling for 25 to 30 minutes, that's probably also going to be factored into your overall interval programming. And in addition to this endurance-based training, there should be at least 2 to 3 days a week of overall resistance-based training as well. Because remember, strength matters when we're physically pushing opponents or barbells around for our own competitive edge. And then to round out that endurance work, I recommend at least 2 sessions per week of heat exposure. That's gonna help improve that overall endurance, along with a couple little tidbits of LSD work. Let's say 20 to 30 minutes of easy LSD. And then having an opponent is one thing, but what about when it's just you, yourself, and you? Like running the 100 or the 200 meters. So if we're looking at non-opponent interval-based sports, we should be doing interval work about 1 to 2 times a week. And one of those factors we have to remember is that if we're looking at a sport like sprinting, a lot of sport-specific work for the sprinter will actually be the endurance-based work. To build the needed power for explosiveness, for twitchiness, for just power output, impulse expression, these athletes should be doing 2 sessions a week of resistance-based training, also with some type of body weight training work on top of that. That could be athlete-based training. And if further endurance-based training is absolutely needed, these individuals could round out that entire week of training with some simple LSD, something that's not going to beat them up. But this is usually covered by their sport-specific practice. All that interval training is fine and good. It's absolutely fantastic. But if we're gonna talk further about endurance training, we have to talk about aerobic capacity. And if we're gonna be looking at that durational strength characteristic, that's going to be classical endurance. So classical endurance sports is gonna be 40+ seconds of actual action, actual activity within that sport without an opponent. The clock being in your head, your opponents and what they're doing being in your head doesn't count. So with classical endurance, we still should be doing sprint work every 8 to 10 days. And typically these sports are technical, but the endurance work is actually going to be done during the sport-specific work. Think about a distance runner, think about a swimmer. When they're doing their technique work or when they're actually running, they're getting their actual endurance training done. So this could be tempo runs, swims, biking 2 times a week. These are all aspects that are gonna play a major role in us embracing that pain cave. So to prevent monotony, let's take a sport like biking. This individual who is a biker could also be doing something that's long, slow distance once a week on their time off. So they could be going for a hike. They could be going for some type of easy LSD work. They could even be going swimming to lead to an improvement in their overall endurance. That's where a specific sport-based program, like the ones that we provide inside of Peak Strength, will also help break up the monotony of classical endurance training. And resistance-based training does need to happen for these specific classical endurance athletes, but the volume comparative to a CrossFitter or to a weightlifter will feel like it's absolutely nothing. However, those classical endurance athletes still should be doing resistance-based training about twice a week, around 30 minutes each session. So head over to peakstrength.app or your device's app store to try Peak Strength for free. So lastly, mobility work should be done on a regular basis to help keep that fascia limbers, to help keep your joints nice and stable. And that about covers it, except for one specific sport, one newish sport that goes after fitness connoisseurs the world over. And that is the sport of CrossFit. Being that CrossFit needs preparation for virtually every single durational strength characteristic imaginable, it requires a scalpel-like precision. Namely, you need to find weak points through various testing protocols. So upon discovering those weak points, we're gonna look at power outputs down, impulse expression is weak, VO2 max is down. You find which one is going to be down the most, and then for the next 8 to 12 weeks, you hammer that specific type of endurance that's gonna help pull that weakness up. And then as the season approaches, for most CrossFit athletes, that's going to mean the open. From 8 to 12 weeks out, now we start to really focus on that individual strengths. In the end, you've gotta know the physiology. You have to know the aspects needed. Push the training accordingly to the sport and then bask in those endurance gains. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace. Programming endurance for athletes requires a ton of consideration. You have to think about strength training, speed work, impulse capabilities, cardio, and the demands specific to that sport. I'm gonna show you how you can program for endurance for all athletes. And we're gonna start right now. Programming endurance for selective athletes has a lot of different things we need to consider. You need to begin by breaking the totality of training down into different components. So when we're looking at athletes, the first thing that I like to do is look at the entire sport and think about what is the work to rest ratio. And fortunately on PubMed, there's also a ton of research across different sports that has already been done that tells you what's the work to rest ratio for, say, lacrosse versus, say, soccer versus, say, American football, anything along those lines. So then we can deduce how much endurance might be needed for those specific sports. After we look at that endurance, we can go down and say, okay, how much strength is needed for these specific sports? So then the next aspect, how much impulse training is needed for that specific sport for them to be very, very explosive. Then that next aspect, how much locomotion is involved? How much actual high speed running versus slower speed running is actually being done in their competitive situation? But how do you actually do that? For this discussion, we're gonna cover off-season training. So off-season training is where we're gonna really try to develop the volume of the athlete, meaning how much time can they spend actually training for their sport, or how much time can they spend even doing the competitive actions or skills of their sport. The next aspect is we have to develop the size of the athlete. And this might be different from sport to sport. So if we have an offensive lineman for football, we want them to get bigger in most cases. If we have a cornerback in football, we don't want them to get too much bigger. We want to analyze their body size and predict where the best size will be for that specific individual. That's going to take us into the muscle mass of the athlete. So now we have to look at how much lean muscle mass does this athlete require for them to be successful in their sport. Look at a sprinter. Sprinters can require a bit more lean muscle mass than, say, a 5K runner or a 10K runner. And then we look at specific problem areas for those sports as well. So we have to analyze what are potential injuries if we have a wrestler or a swimmer or a 5K runner or a football player, and then how are we gonna build our training around those potential injuries. All fine and good, but now I can hear you guys behind the screen saying, that's great, but what does any of this have to do with endurance? Remember, this is about programming endurance for all athletes. Not all endurance is going to be the same. To illustrate that, let's look at a football player here and then look at a 5K distance runner here. So when we compare those two, there will be a substantial difference. And when we start, we have to look at out of season. We're gonna focus on trying to build volume specific to the endurance needed for those athletes. Going to be identifying how big the actual athlete is, right? So how large are they? How big is the football player? How big is that 5K distance runner? Then we have to look at actual muscle mass, okay? How lean are they, or how much lean muscle mass do they have? And then finally, we need to look at what potential problems might we run into. And so for that football player, we might be focusing on, let's get their glutes bigger, let's get their quads bigger, let's get their shoulders even bigger. Plyometrics, some speed work, some big upper body work. Ultimately, that's gonna mean let's get them stronger inside of the weight room so that they can have a higher capability of impulse expression. The football player has to run fast, and they have to be able to repeat that speed on a regular basis with a specific rest time designated by the actual competitive sport. Some unique ways that we can get that endurance would be get some bigger guys on an assault bike, get them to increase their VO2 max on an assault bike because there's less pounding on their body. If we've got somebody like a running back or a linebacker, we can do 10 sets of 10-meter sprints where we run 10 meters as fast as possible, slow down over a 10-meter time frame, and then repeat that for those 10 sets. And then a simple way to increase overall endurance-based volume is to just get into the sauna 4 to 5 days a week if your school has access to something along those lines. But ultimately for a football player, traditional endurance should only be about 10 to 15% of their total programming volume. That's all they need in the off season. But what about that 5K distance runner? And this may catch you off guard, but the distance runner also needs more size, just like the football player. However, the distance runner needs more size by creating more blood volume. That's where that size is from, the blood volume. And to do this, 5K runners have to increase their pace over long periods of time. So they've got to do training over very long periods. This can be an hour to 2 hours of longer runs. And that's gonna lead to more blood volume, which in turn will lead to more mitochondrial volume, which in turn ideally will lead to a greater amount of ATP production. Now, when we're also looking at distance runners, we also need to program some twitchiness. And the way I look at twitchiness for a 5K runner, yes, I do think about plyometrics to a point, but I also think about high intensity interval work. So if we're doing about 15 to 20% of our training volume around endurance-based training with high intensity interval work, that's gonna train our heart to pump more explosively, meaning it's gonna get more volume throughout the body, and in turn, now this individual will indeed be able to hold a much higher pace within a race for a much longer period of time. But what does all that mean for the athletes? So when programming volume for endurance athletes, what ends up happening is that we want to see greater volume, which in turn leads to an adaptation of greater blood volume. And then when there's a greater amount of blood volume, we will see an adaptation that will lead to greater capillarization. We're now gonna see that there's gonna be greater oxygen transportation from the lungs into the muscles. Now this 5K distance runner can take more oxygen into their muscles and they can produce greater amounts of ATP. If they can produce greater amounts of ATP, they can now sustain a greater pace for a longer period of time. Thus, they're running faster if they're in a specific race, or just by having a higher pace or a faster pace. Now, when they get more training volume, they can continuously push themselves quite a bit and then lead to those faster times. What ends up happening is that there tends to be greater ground reaction forces every time that we plant. So to sustain our stability, our structural integrity, we should be doing about 5 to 10% of our training based around strength training to prevent injuries. But what else is there? Primarily when programming, we have to establish how much impulse work is there gonna be, how much strength work, how much speed work, and how much endurance work, okay? So we have to create some sense of a profile. Force velocity profiling, I do not believe is the most effective, mainly because there is not an inverse relationship between force and velocity. I think it's more effective to create a profile for specific sports and specific athletes based off impulse, strength, speed, endurance. And so if we're looking at football players, okay, we're gonna have 25% of their training be impulse based. So that might be plyometric based, that might be even in the weight room doing things like unbroken at certain percentages, at certain tempos. Then we're gonna look at the football player for strength based training. And this is gonna be a general analysis. Inside of our strength training at peak strength, one thing that we do is we try to separate football players into, okay, we got QBs, we've got running backs, and we've got linemen. So this percentage will be slightly different based upon the position. Overall, if we look at strength, most football players will be in the weight room 35% of their time. Then we can look at that speed work. About 25% of their training should go towards some type of speed work. This could be hill sprints, this could be sled sprints, anything like that, right? Even running mechanics. And then finally, endurance should make up, check out that sweet lungs with the heart, should make up about 10 to 15% of their overall training. All right, and if we compare that to that 5K runner, we might see 10 to 15% of their work is impulse based. So some type of jumping, maybe even some type of faster lifting. Then we look at their strength work. We've got to make sure that they have some type of stability, some type of structural stability so that they have injury prevention. That's going to be about 10%. Then we start to look at speed and endurance. Think about Nico Young. He just broke the 5K NCAA record. He just won the NCAA title. He is extraordinarily fast. And that speed work will be about 25% of their overall training. Okay, and then endurance work is gonna be about 50% of their overall training. That could involve high intensity interval work, that could be including some of their longer distance work, okay? So this is all stuff that we try to use inside of our app Peak Strength. If you guys need help with your training, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store, and you'll see there's a little bit of a breakdown along these lines, and we're even in the process of going more in depth with that speed and endurance, because remember, freaks, if you wanna become a champion, you've always gotta cultivate your power. Peace.